Hi, Pastor Anthony Savaggio of the Rochester Christian Reformed Church. On August 2nd, I'm beginning a sermon series on the book of Lamentations, and I've done a series of introductory videos for that. If you're interested, they're under the title Bible Bistro. There's 6 videos introducing that sermon series, but I wanted to release a special video, a short one. This will be a short video on the issue of gender and sexuality in Lamentations, and particularly in Lamentations, the first and second chapters, most acutely the first chapter, which I'll be dealing with on August 2nd. So we have here in Lamentations the challenge, first of all, that the city of Jerusalem is personified in the female gender. Now, as you know, if you watch the other videos, the context of Lamentations is the Babylonian captivity, and in which the city of Jerusalem was destroyed, brought to the ground. It was terrorized by an opposing force doing violence against the city and its inhabitants. And so the personification of this in the female gender obviously brings up imagery of violence being perpetrated against a woman, which is the city of Jerusalem, sometimes referred to in the text itself as Daughter Zion, or by commentators as Lady Zion. And so we've got that challenge right away of dealing with how do we understand that, the choice of gendering the city. And also in the book, there is a male voice, a narrator, that's also kind of going alongside, particularly in chapters 1 and 2. And there's some very interesting dynamics of the transition between chapter 1 and chapter 2 of this male narrator, who in chapter 1 kind of reports events and perhaps focuses on the sin of the city. And then in chapter 2, as we'll see, there's a change in the perspective of that narrator, where he becomes one who not only identifies with the suffering of the victim, but also becomes a witness and a champion, if you will, for the victim as well. So we've got, first of all, that whole issue of being gendered at all. That presents challenges. And then even more challenging is that within that there is also sexual imagery. And so this brings up imagery of sexual abuse or sexual violence, and how to handle that, particularly it being gendered. What do we make of this? How do we deal with it? And so there's been a variety of responses to that by commentators. Some wish to simply kind of gloss over it and ignore it or redefine it in a way. And I even kind of in my introductory videos ran into some commentators who were doing that. And I didn't, unbeknownst to me. So there is this temptation to kind of gloss over that language, to make it something that it really isn't. The language is strong in the text. So redefining it, I don't think is being honest and authentic with the text itself. The second option is to excise it. Now, and this has been advocated, particularly by some feminist scholars, is to remove this, that it's so offensive, it shouldn't be in the part of the scripture at all, that we should basically excise it. And I can't obviously embrace that view, although I understand the motivations and the concerns that gave rise to it. So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us to do a lot of hard work and to really grapple with the text, to try to understand it. And particularly what that means is that we need to understand it in its original cultural context. What did it actually mean to convey to the readers there? So we have to enter into that original culture to make sure we're not merely imposing modern cultural mores into it. But that doesn't end the process, right? Then we have to think about, well, how does that translate into modern cultural mores, and how should we look at that? And we need to do that with a critical eye. But it behooves us to look first and understand the original cultural context. And what I've done to try to do that is a couple of things. One, I did reach out to our denominational seminary to see if I could get an interview with a professor of Old Testament. That did not work out, particularly a female professor. But she did send me an article particularly about Ezekiel and some of the imagery there, which is helpful. And if you're interested in that article, you can email me. I'll send that article to you. It is a helpful article. But so that's one thing I did. And then the other thing, in absence of being able to get an actual live interview, I engaged by reading a variety of female scholars as well as male scholars, but I wanted to focus on what some renowned female biblical Old Testament scholars were saying about this text. And so that's kind of what I'm going to present here a little bit, particularly from a scholar known as Adele Berlin, who prior to her retirement was the Robert H. Smith Professor of Biblical Studies at the University of Maryland. She's well-regarded Old Testament scholar, and her views I'll be sharing in a moment. But let's just kind of begin with a little bit of an illustration of the hard work we need to do here. So I was listening to a podcast recently, and it was a father was recounting how he was introducing his daughters, his teenage daughters, to some movie series, and so they went back and they chose Rocky, the Rocky series of movies, which I don't know, I think there's 8 of them or something, and so they started with the original. Now, if you recall the original film, it was critically acclaimed, it won Academy Awards, I think it was the Best Picture, and they went back and watched that film. And it was interesting for the father to go back and watch it, and of course the 2 daughters who were watching it with him. There's a scene in there where Rocky is in his apartment with Adrian, and she wants to leave the room, and he kind of forcefully closes the door, and there's a sexual encounter that happens in that context. And so these young women who are watching this were like, this guy's the hero? I mean, this seems like totally a violation of all modern cultural mores about what consent means and all of that. And the father was kind of like, whoa, yeah, I'm kind of, this never struck me when I was watching this movie before. I use that example only to say that, cultural mores change. Here's something that's 50 years old or 40 years old or 50 years old, and, that things have changed and how we perceive things. So what you want to do is understand what were the cultural mores at the time that led people not to see that. And I'm not saying that those were right cultural mores, but we need to understand them to understand the art and the genre and the film, and to put it in perspective, and then we can apply a critical eye of looking back with some critique of that and whether that was appropriate. So if you take that same thing with Lamentations 1, you have to go back a lot further in history here. Obviously, we're back in 586, 587 BC, and things were very different. So what do you do with all of that? What do you do with the sexual imagery, the gendered nature of the city of Jerusalem, and what do we do with that? Well, the best I can offer you, and I want to be sensitive to this in preaching it, but I also want to be authentic to the text, and I didn't want to take a whole bunch of time in the sermon to do this, obviously, but I think the best way to address this and to deal with it and to understand it has been presented by Adele Berlin. And I just want to read her, let her voice kind of guide us here. It's a little bit extended, but I think it's worth listening to when you engage this text to do so properly, to understand what's going on. She writes this about gender and sexuality in Lamentations. She starts, some feminist readers, and by the way, this is from her commentary, I should say, from her commentary in it's a 2002 commentary on Lamentations, part of the Old Testament library from Presbyterian Publishing. And this is what she writes. Some feminist readers have been sharply critical of the use of female sexual imagery in the prophetic books and in Lamentations. The more radical among them wish these passages could be excised from the Bible because they claim such language and imagery, sexist and violent as it is, denigrates women and even promotes the abuse of women. So you see the concern of feminist scholars here with this material is that this is denigrating women and it may actually be providing a narrative for abuse. She goes on. The imagery is certainly sexual, violent, and degrading, and it is largely thanks to feminist interpretation that we have become sensitive to this fact. So here's the contribution of feminist scholarship. But she goes on, but I cannot agree that these images are harmful to women in the real world or that they promote sexual abuse or denigrate women. So she's departing here. The author personifies Jerusalem as a woman because this is commonplace in his world of thought. He chooses particular female images precisely because they are shocking and do not represent normative behavior. The imagery is meant to evoke a strong feeling of horror and outrage, immorality and shame, suffering and pity, because this mixture of reactions is a crucial part of the poet's message. If readers feel self-blame and self-pity, the sympathy and disgust and the violence and sense of being violated, then the poet has succeeded. She goes on, feminists are to be commended for showing us the depth of these images, but they ought not then wish them away, for they are the heart of the poetry. They are no more, quote-unquote, pornographic than the images of general human suffering that suffuse the book and are every bit as necessary for the message. She concludes, and this is it right here in a nutshell. The poet wants to show that Jerusalem is in the most horrendous condition conceivable, and for that, he chooses the image of an abused woman. Surely this does not denigrate women. If anything, it says that there is no suffering worse than that of an abused woman. Even the most unfaithful of women, says the poet, should not have to suffer the sexual abuse and degradation that Jerusalem suffered. So that's how she explains it and approaches it, and I am following with her. I'll be using her work along with that of Kathleen O'Connor, who's an excellent scholar. Her commentary on Lamentations is also quite useful and helpful. So I hope that helps to provide some ways of maybe removing some of the obstacles and offense from listening to the text and maybe grappling with that about what is going on here. It's the best way the poet had to communicate the horror of what was happening in Jerusalem and the pain and the suffering of the people. So I hope that helps you engage with the book and maybe helps to remove some obstacles to it. I want to take this book seriously. I also want to be sensitive to how it might impact people who are listening to it. So I hope that proves helpful. Thanks for listening today, and I hope that you will engage with Lamentations.